Chapter 1. The Sibylline Books. In the waning years of the Roman monarchy, when kings still ruled from the Palatine Hill and the Republic had not yet stirred in the cradle of ambition, a stranger arrived in Rome. She came alone, unannounced, bearing 9 scrolls wrapped in linen and sealed with wax. Her hair, it said, was unbound and streaked with age, and her voice, though calm, carried the unsettling weight of certainty. She called herself a Sibyl, a word the Romans were not yet accustomed to, but would come to associate with the boundary between the mortal and the divine. She claimed her scrolls contained prophecies of Rome's future, not just visions, but guidance, warnings, conditions, commands. They were not to be read lightly, and they came at a price. She sought an audience with the king, Tarquinius Superbus, known to history less for his wisdom than for his pride. He was the last of the Roman kings, and not by coincidence. He ruled with calculated force, impatient with superstition, sceptical of those who could not be controlled. Still, the woman intrigued him, her bearing too composed to dismiss as mad, her eyes too knowing to ignore. She named her price for the 9 scrolls. It was steep. Too steep, he thought, for what seemed mere parchment and metaphor. He scoffed. She left without protest. Days passed. Then she returned. This time she carried only 6 scrolls. She made the same offer for the same price. Tarquinius, startled, asked what became of the other 3. She told him she had burned them. Unmoved by this performance, the king refused again. She vanished once more. When she returned a 3rd time, only 3 scrolls remained. The price had not changed. Now Tarquinius hesitated. 3 times she had offered, and twice he had refused. What if this was not madness but a test? What kind of person destroys wisdom to prove its worth? What kind of fool fails to see value until most of it is gone? He agreed. He paid her the full price. She handed over the 3 surviving scrolls and disappeared from the records of Rome. Whether she walked back into the hills or simply faded into myth, no one could say. But the bargain had been struck. And with it, a new channel opened between the Roman state and the forces it could not command, but dared to consult. The scrolls were placed in the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, where they remained under lock, key, and reverent fear. These were not books in the modern sense. They were oracular poems, obscure and richly metaphorical, said to be written in Greek hexameter. They did not name dates or kings. They did not offer maps to the future. They offered riddles, visions cloaked in imagery, warnings sheathed in allegory. When disaster loomed, famine, plague, eclipse, invasion, the Senate turned to the books, not for explanation, but for instruction. The Sibylline books did not say what would happen. They said what must be done. Access to the scrolls was strictly limited. 2 priests known as the Dumviri Sacris Faciundis were appointed to guard and interpret them. Over time, this number would expand to 10, and later 15. But the principle remained. The books were not for the people. They were not read aloud in the forum or studied in schools. They were a sacred technology of the state, wielded in emergencies, deciphered only by those trained or sanctioned to understand them. Their secrecy amplified their power. The less the public knew of their contents, the more weight their interpretations carried. When Rome faced terror from without, the Gauls at the gates, Hannibal crossing the Alps, or chaos from within, disease, fire, drought, the Senate might order the books consulted. The priests would withdraw into ritual, pore over the verses, and emerge with decrees. Often, these took the form of religious acts, the importation of a foreign god, the construction of a new temple, a public purification. During the Second Punic War, it was the Sibylline books that led Rome to bring the cult of Magna Mater, the Great Mother, from Asia Minor. A foreign goddess was brought to the city not out of curiosity or conquest, but by prophetic instruction. The message had been clear, if indirect. Only with the presence of this mother spirit could Rome hope to repel Carthage. Sometimes the recommendations seemed symbolic, almost theatrical. In one case, during a crisis of omens and fear, the books advised burying alive a pair of Greeks and a pair of Gauls in the Forum Boreum. The act was brutal, but it echoed an older, more archaic Rome, one still entangled with sacrificial thinking, where blood and ritual could realign the cosmos. The Sibylline books, for all their poetic structure, did not traffic in gentle morality. They spoke the language of divine necessity, not human kindness. And yet, they were not always obeyed. Interpretation left room for maneuver, and at times the Senate resisted or revised their implications. But the act of consulting them, the public acknowledgement that the crisis had reached a threshold where even the cryptic must be heard, carried immense symbolic weight. Rome was not a theocracy, but it was a state shaped by ritual, omen, and the conviction that the gods had a stake in its fate. The Sibylline books gave form to that belief. They provided a bridge between civic decision and sacred mandate. Their authority endured for centuries, but their material form did not. In 83 BCE, a fire consumed the temple of Jupiter. The books, kept in a stone chest, were destroyed. It was not merely a loss of artifacts. It was a rupture in Rome's dialogue with its own destiny. The Senate did not accept this silently. In a remarkable effort of cultural salvage, it dispatched envoys across the Mediterranean to collect similar oracles, in Greek cities, in Asia Minor, anywhere whispers of prophecy still echoed. The fragments were brought back, sifted and selected. New Sibylline books were compiled and placed in a rebuilt temple. They were not the originals. They were reconstructions, approximations. But their authority resumed. This act of rebuilding reveals something essential about Roman thinking. The content of the books mattered, but so did the institution of the books, the idea that Rome could consult a sanctioned voice beyond politics, beyond faction. Even if the source was lost, the need remained. The new collection may have been a mosaic of disparate oracles, stitched together from different traditions, but it functioned as the old had, cryptic, sacred, and summoned in extremity. Over time, the books became entangled in imperial politics. Augustus used them to legitimize religious reforms and architectural projects. Later, emperors guarded or exploited them, depending on circumstance. They were consulted less frequently, but their aura persisted. The mystery of their origin was the Sibyl Greek. Etruscan, a construct of later legend, only deepened their power. Their destruction in the fire, their resurrection through foreign fragments, their preservation and eventual disappearance. All of it contributed to the sense that these were not ordinary texts. They were a mirror Rome held up to itself, reflecting both its anxieties and its aspirations. The final disappearance of the Sibylline books is uncertain. Some say they were hidden away by Christian emperors, deemed incompatible with the new faith. Others believe they were quietly forgotten, their relevance eroded by the decline of public divination. But they never fully faded. Their legend lived on in literature and lore. To later ages, they became a symbol of ancient wisdom, veiled, incomplete, and always just out of reach. In the end, the Sibylline books were not about prediction, but about legitimacy. They offered not knowledge of the future, but a framework for decision in moments of fear. They cloaked political acts in divine authority, but they also reminded Rome that its fate could not be governed by force alone. There were other powers, older, darker, less malleable. The Sibyl did not give answers. She gave riddles. But in those riddles, Rome found something more enduring than certainty. The illusion that the future could speak, and the faith to listen. Chapter 2. Nostradamus' Centuries. Michel de Nostradame was born in December of 1503 in the Provençal town of Saint-Rémy de Provence, a modest settlement in the sun-drenched south of France. He arrived into a world already fraying at the seams. Europe, at the dawn of the 16th century, was a continent in tension, not yet torn apart by war, but marked by plague, religious unrest, and the slow unravelling of old certainties. The Catholic Church held power, but not uncontested. Humanism was gaining ground, and across villages and cities, the shadow of the Black Death still lingered like a permanent stain on memory. The world Michel entered was not stable. It was watchful, wounded, and ready to believe that history moved in cycles, not progress. Michel was the son of a grain merchant and a notary, part of a Jewish family that had converted to Catholicism a generation earlier under social and legal pressure. From an early age, he showed an aptitude for learning. He studied Latin, Greek, mathematics, and astrology, the intellectual scaffolding of the Renaissance, before going on to train as a physician. He treated victims of the plague in towns across southern France, refusing to flee when outbreaks came, and favouring fresh air, hygiene, and herbal remedies over the bloodletting and superstition of the time. His medical work earned him respect, but it was the constant proximity to death that shaped his view of the world more deeply. He saw firsthand how disease paid no mind to hierarchy. Kings and peasants died the same. Cities could collapse overnight. Human life was fragile, and the rhythms of catastrophe, whether plague, famine, or war, had a terrible consistency. It was this worldview, forged in medicine and shaped by the anxious culture of a 16th-century Europe, that eventually found its expression in prophecy. By midlife, Michel had Latinized his name, as was common among educated men, and began calling himself Nostradamus. Around the 1550s, now settled in the town of Salon de Provence, he began composing the texts that would make his name echo through centuries. A collection of nearly 1,000 four-line poems, or quatrains, known as the Centuries. The title itself suggested a structure. Each century was a group of 100 quatrains, though the final volume stopped short at 42. The poems were not organized chronologically. They did not form a clear narrative. Instead, they sprawled, cryptic, dense and strangely addictive. They referenced historical events, astrological alignments, biblical echoes, and geographic clues, but never in a way that could be pinned down with certainty. Nostradamus claimed to draw from a mixture of ancient sources, astrological calculation, and divine inspiration. Whether one believes that or not, the result was unmistakable. 942 poetic fragments that seem to speak from a place just outside of time. His motivations remain a matter of debate. Some see Nostradamus as a man trying to hedge his bets in an era where prophecy could be treated as heresy. Obscurity, in that view, was a protective strategy. Others believe he saw himself as part of a long tradition of seers, a conduit for messages, not their author. And then there are those who view the centuries as a kind of intellectual legacy project, an attempt to speak to future generations, knowing he would never meet them, but trusting that they would seek meaning in his lines. What is clear is that Nostradamus was deliberate. His quatrains were not dashed off in feverish trances. He edited, he revised, he encoded. The style of the centuries became as important as its content. Nostradamus wrote in a hybrid language that defied easy translation. French served as the base, but Latin, Greek, and even regional dialects crept in. He used anagrams, mythological references, historical allusions, and astrological shorthand. This wasn't mysticism for its own sake. It was strategic fog. The ambiguity protected him from accusation and ensured that his words could be reinterpreted again and again. He created a text that resisted final meaning. In doing so, he invited a kind of readerly collaboration. People would see in his words what they feared, or hoped, was true, and they did. Over the centuries, Nostradamus's quatrains have been mined for signs of everything from revolutions to world wars. Some interpretations have become almost canonical in the lore surrounding him. One passage, for example, is believed by many to reference Napoleon Bonaparte. It speaks of an emperor born near Italy who will rise to power and bring ruin, only to fall. The geographic and thematic cues fit, though only loosely. The text never names Napoleon directly. And that's the point. Nostradamus never names anyone directly. Another famous quatrain contains the word hyster, which some have taken as a near anagram of Hitler. The verse describes a leader rising from the depths of Europe, wielding terrible power. To believers, it feels prophetic. To skeptics, it's linguistic coincidence. Hyster was an old name for the lower Danube River, a region tied more closely to Roman geography than modern Germany. Still, the resemblance stirs something. It feels too close. And that feeling, that sense of eerie nearness, is what gives the quatrain its grip. Other links have been drawn between Nostradamus and the French Revolution, the Great Fire of London, and even the September 11th attacks. In the case of 1666, during the fire that swept through London, it's said that readers of the centuries scrambled to find quatrains describing a great burning city. They found one, of course, one that could plausibly match the scene if read just loosely enough. In the aftermath of September 11th, similar patterns emerged. People claimed that Nostradamus had predicted metal birds and twin brothers torn apart. But these verses, once circulated widely online, were often revealed to be apocryphal. Modern fabrications passed off as authentic. This pattern recurs. Tragedy strikes, and people turn to the centuries not for prevention, but for confirmation. They look back, not forward. After the fact, they find what they're looking for, or convince themselves they have. Critics argue that this is the heart of the Nostradamus phenomenon. His verses are not prophecies so much as literary Rorschach tests. They adapt to the reader. They reflect the mood of the time more than the specifics of the future. Historians have noted that attempts to use Nostradamus's quatrains to predict events before they occur have rarely succeeded. The language is too broad, the references too pliable. But after a disaster, once the shape of the event is known, the connections seem to leap out. This retroactive clarity gives the illusion of foresight. In this way, the centuries become less like a map and more like a mirror, a text that reflects the collective anxieties of those who read it. And yet, despite the skepticism, Nostradamus endures. His name still circulates every time a major event unsettles the world. During wars, plagues, and crises, sales of the centuries spike. He is quoted in tabloids, documentaries, and late-night television. In 2020, amid the global pandemic, Nostradamus was invoked again. A respiratory illness sweeping across continents. Surely he must have written about that. Whether he did or didn't became secondary to the desire for connection. People wanted to believe that someone had seen this coming. Why does Nostradamus still matter? Perhaps because his work satisfies a psychological hunger. In a world of chaos, prophecy offers structure. Even when it is vague or contradictory, it implies that events are not random, that someone, somewhere, once knew this would happen. The centuries give shape to the fear of disorder. They turn dread into pattern. And because the patterns are so loose, they can fit almost anything. There's also the allure of timelessness. Nostradamus feels old enough to be from another age, yet relevant enough to speak to the present. He belongs to no single era. This flexibility makes him uniquely durable. He is less a man now than a mythic function, the prophet who warned us, if only we had known how to read him. It is easy to forget that behind the legend was a real man, scribbling by candlelight, drawing charts of stars, and living through the fever of his time. Nostradamus was not writing for entertainment. He was writing into the void, trying to impose some order on the vast and shapeless unknown. He saw cycles of plague and collapse. He knew the fragility of regimes, the volatility of mobs, the suddenness with which everything could burn. The centuries are not cheerful texts. They are filled with violence, upheaval, and ruin. But beneath the imagery lies a deeper structure, a belief that fate leaves traces, that signs exist, if only we could learn to read them. What we inherit from Nostradamus is not certainty, but ambiguity elevated into legacy. He understood, perhaps better than most, that a prophecy that is too clear dies quickly. A vague one lives forever. He chose the latter. And in doing so, he wrote not a book of answers, but a book that keeps asking questions about history, about meaning, and about the strange comfort we take in believing that someone, somewhere, saw it all coming. Chapter 3. The Mayan Calendar and 2012 Prophecy. Long before the arrival of Spanish ships on Mesoamerican shores, before the jungle swallowed stone pyramids and writing systems were silenced by conquest, the ancient Maya were keeping time with a precision that rivaled anything Europe would achieve for centuries. They tracked the rising and setting of Venus, predicted solar eclipses, and measured lunar cycles with a mathematic elegance grounded in observation and belief. To them, time was not a line but a pattern, layered, cyclic, alive. It governed the rhythm of crops, rituals, births, wars, and dynasties. Time had personality. It had force. And the Maya did not simply live within it. They charted it with extraordinary intent. The Maya civilization stretched across what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. At its height, it was a constellation of city-states, each with towering step pyramids, palaces, and ball courts. Cities like Tikal, Palenque, and Copan were urban marvels, supported by complex agricultural systems and ruled by elite classes who commissioned stone monuments covered in hieroglyphs. These inscriptions recorded dynastic successions, political alliances, and sacred rites, all anchored to specific dates. Timekeeping was not a background function. It was woven into governance and religion. The priest-astronomers who calculated the heavens also directed the rituals that maintained cosmic balance. Among the systems the Maya developed to measure time, the long count stands apart. It was not designed for seasonal planting or short-term ritual timing. The long count was built to reckon vast cycles, to record mythic origins, historical eras, and the great sweep of human and cosmic history. It begins with a base date, what we call August 11th, 3114 BCE, using the Gregorian calendar. For the Maya, this marked the beginning of the current world age, the creation of this epoch in which human beings and gods coexist in a delicate arrangement. From there, the calendar unfolds across layers of units. Kin, a day. Uinal, 20 days. Tun, 360 days. Katun, 7,200 days. And Baktun, 144,000 days, or roughly 394 years. 13 Baktuns form a full cycle in the long count system. 13 was a sacred number in Maya cosmology, and when multiplied by the Baktun unit, it yields a period of approximately 5,125 years. The completion of this span, 13 Baktuns since the creation date, fell on what corresponds to December 21st, 2012. This date, recorded on a handful of Maya inscriptions, notably one found at the site of Tortuguero in Tabasco, Mexico, became the focal point for a modern myth that would spiral far beyond its historical roots. For the ancient Maya, the ending of the 13th Baktun was not prophesied as a cataclysm. It was a resetting of the great cycle, the completion of a full round in the calendar's deepest register. If we imagine a cosmic odometer, it was rolling over, not exploding. Scholars who study Maya texts point out that the Tortuguero inscription does not predict an apocalypse. Instead, it references the descent or appearance of a god, possibly a ritual event to occur on that date, though the inscription is fragmentary. In other words, the date had significance, as any grand anniversary might, but not doom. Yet by the late 20th century, this ancient calendrical milestone had been appropriated and transformed. In 1987, José Argüelles, a New Age author and artist, published The Mayan Factor, a book that fused Maya calendar systems with speculative cosmology, astrological symbolism, and a dose of countercultural mysticism. Arguez cast the 2012 date not as an end in the traditional sense, but as a moment of planetary transformation, the closure of one cycle and the potential awakening of global consciousness. He linked it with a galactic synchronization, blending Maya timekeeping with ideas drawn from Eastern philosophy, extraterrestrial lore, and modern spiritual movements. His work did not reflect scholarly consensus on Maya cosmology, but it found an eager audience. As the year 2012 drew nearer, the interpretations multiplied. Some saw the date as a spiritual pivot, the emergence of a new human era, one aligned with peace, ecological awareness, and collective evolution. Others adopted a darker view. They predicted magnetic pole reversals, solar flares, planetary alignments triggering massive earthquakes, or even direct collisions with rogue celestial bodies. These visions were fed not by archaeological evidence, but by a growing ecosystem of books, websites, documentaries, and forums. The Internet gave the 2012 myth new speed and reach, allowing fringe theories to move from niche discussions to global anxiety. Popular culture did not hesitate to capitalize on the growing buzz. Roland Emmerich's 2009 film, 2012, offered a spectacle of worldwide destruction. Tidal waves engulfing cities, continents cracking apart, monuments reduced to rubble. Though it bore little resemblance to actual Maya beliefs, the film helped cement the idea of December 21st as a ticking clock. News outlets ran segments questioning what, if anything, would happen. Survivalist communities made plans. Even NASA, receiving a spike in public concern, issued statements debunking the more extreme predictions. The US government received enough letters from frightened citizens, including children, that it felt compelled to clarify. No astronomical threats, no planetary alignments, no Maya apocalypse. Behind this frenzy was a deeper question, not about what the Maya believed, but about what modern people feared. The early 21st century was already marked by unease. The September 11th attacks had shattered the illusion of Western invulnerability. Climate change loomed with increasing urgency. Financial systems were trembling. The 2012 myth became a vessel for those anxieties, a way to channel diffuse dread into a single date-bound event. In that sense, it didn't matter whether the original Maya texts supported the idea. The prophecy was never purely about them. It was about us. Archaeologists and Maya scholars, meanwhile, consistently stressed that the end of the 13th Baktun was best understood as a turning of the calendar, akin to how we mark millennia. There is no evidence that the ancient Maya viewed the completion of a Baktun cycle with fear. In fact, monumental inscriptions show that they projected future dates far beyond 2012, including some that stretch millions of years into the future. Time, in their system, did not stop. It flowed onward in nested cycles of renewal. At the classic Maya site of Palenque, for example, a temple inscription notes a future date over 4,000 years after 2012, a commemoration of the birth of a king, projected into a time that would not be reached for millennia. This is not the thinking of a civilization preoccupied with endings. It is the worldview of a people comfortable with vast spans of time, who saw their place not as final, but recurring. The Maya did not believe in a linear apocalypse. They believed in cyclical regeneration, worlds ending and beginning in patterns. Their creation myth describes earlier worlds that had risen and fallen, not in judgment, but in the rhythm of time's unfolding. The long count calendar, with its 13s and backtoons and glyphs carved in stone, was not a countdown. It was a map of recurrence, one where the 13th backtoon's end was significant, yes, but not terminal. Still, the persistence of the 2012 myth reveals something more enduring than misinformation. It shows how powerfully people long to locate themselves in a greater pattern, especially during times of uncertainty. The idea of a fixed date for transformation or collapse gives shape to fears that otherwise feel ungraspable. Whether cast as salvation or disaster, the notion of an endpoint offers clarity, and clarity, even false, can be comforting. There's also something striking about how a civilization once buried by conquest, its books burned, its language nearly extinguished, became the source of a global prophecy. Most of the world had ignored Maya achievements for centuries. But in 2012, their calendar became a symbol, albeit a distorted one, of ancient insight and cosmic timing. That this came not from Maya voices, but from a chorus of modern interpreters only deepened the irony. The people who created the long count were largely absent from the global conversation about its meaning. Today, Maya descendants still live throughout Central America. Many maintain cultural traditions, speak Mayan languages, and honor elements of the old calendar. For them, December 21st, 2012 was not the end of the world. It was, in some cases, a day of ceremony, a celebration of continuity, of having reached another milestone in the count. Some elders held fire rituals. Others simply watched as outsiders projected catastrophe onto a date that, for them, marked survival. Looking back, the 2012 phenomenon serves less as evidence of Maya foresight and more as a mirror of modern restlessness. The fascination with endings is not new. It recurs wherever change accelerates, where institutions falter, where the future seems too complex to face directly. That the Maya, timekeepers of extraordinary precision and spiritual depth, became the authors of a misunderstood apocalypse, tells us more about the anxieties of our own era than about theirs. In the end, December 21st, 2012 passed like any other day. The sun rose. No planets collided. No sudden transformation rewrote the human spirit. But the story of that date, the fear, the hope, the speculation, continues to echo. Not because the prophecy was true, but because it met a need to believe that time carries meaning, that somewhere, carved in stone and preserved across centuries, there is a message for us. And in that hope, even in its misreading, we find the enduring power of prophecy, not as forecast, but as reflection. Chapter 4. The Oracle of Delphi. High on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, where the limestone cliffs rise sharp against the sky and the olive trees catch the shifting light, there once stood the most revered sanctuary in the ancient Greek world. Delphi was not the largest or richest of the city-states. It held no empire. It commanded no army. But in influence, it rivaled them all. The ancients called it the Omphalos, the navel of the world, a point where the divine touched the earth, and where mortals might, if only briefly, receive the voice of a god. Delphi's power did not lie in conquest. It lay in prophecy. From a temple dedicated to Apollo, the god of light, music and truth, the words of the future were spoken through a human mouth. The Pythia, a priestess chosen and prepared, was believed to channel the will of Apollo himself. Her voice, uttered in trance, was shaped into riddles that leaders would carry into battle, into council, into the shaping of their city's destinies. For nearly 1,000 years, kings and generals made the journey to this sacred place, not to command, but to ask. The sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi was more than a religious site. It was a cultural anchor, its influence rippling through art, architecture, politics, and war. Visitors approached the temple along the sacred way, a winding path lined with treasuries, votive offerings, and monuments erected by city-states eager to honor the god and display their wealth. At the heart of it all stood the temple itself, adorned with columns and inscriptions, and deep within it, the Adyton, the innermost chamber where the Pythia would descend into her trance. She was not a prophet in the modern sense. The Pythia was a living vessel, a mortal body thought to be filled with divine presence. Once selected, usually from among older women of good character and simple background, she underwent ritual purification before each session. Accounts describe her sitting upon a 3-legged tripod, positioned above a fissure in the earth. From this chasm, vapours were said to rise, perhaps natural gases, perhaps symbolic, and as she inhaled, the transformation began. Her speech turned fragmented, poetic, difficult to pass. Attending priests stood by, interpreting her words and translating them into hexameter verse. What emerged was not a conversation, but a revelation. We do not know exactly what the Pythia experienced. Ancient sources vary. Some describe ecstatic possession, a loss of self in the god's overwhelming presence. Others suggest a more restrained trance, solemn rather than frenzied. Modern scholars have debated whether the vapours had any physical effect at all. Geological studies suggest the presence of ethylene gas in the region, which could produce mild hallucinations or altered states of consciousness. But even without pharmacology, the weight of ritual, the expectations of those gathered, and the setting itself could induce a state of altered awareness. The cave-like chamber, the chanting, the incense, the heavy sense of the sacred. These alone were enough to carry a mind somewhere else. What matters more than the mechanism is the effect. The Oracle of Delphi became a decisive voice in the Greek world. Her pronouncements carried weight in matters of war, colonization, and law. City-states consulted her before founding new settlements. Leaders sought her guidance before launching campaigns. Foreign rulers from Lydia, Persia, and Rome travelled or sent emissaries to seek her counsel. One of the most famous consultations came from Croesus, king of Lydia, who asked whether he should attack the growing Persian Empire. The oracle responded, "If you cross the river, a great empire will fall." Encouraged, Croesus attacked and lost. The empire that fell was his own. But the prophecy stood, its ambiguity intact, its truth undeniable in hindsight. That ambiguity was not a flaw. It was the oracle's power. Her responses were layered with double meanings, open to interpretation, but resistant to dismissal. You will go, you will return, never in war will you perish. a line that, without punctuation, could mean either salvation or doom. These phrases gave room for belief and strategy to coexist. A leader might hear what he wanted or what he feared, but rarely something so precise it could be disproven. In a culture that prized oratory and rhetoric, the Pythia's words became tools of persuasion, not just revelation. Delphi's influence extended beyond the religious. It was a hub of diplomacy. Its pan-Hellenic status gave it a rare neutrality in a world of shifting alliances. Decisions made there shaped alliances, justified policies, and conferred legitimacy. The Amphictyonic League, a council of Greek tribes, met at Delphi and administered the sanctuary. In this way, the oracle was embedded not only in spiritual life, but in the machinery of power. Prophecy and politics were never entirely separate. The priests who managed the sanctuary were aware of the stakes. Their role was not to dictate outcomes, but to maintain the oracle's credibility, to guard the sanctity of ambiguity, to make sure the god's voice remained above reproach, even when it served the needs of the city. To imagine Delphi in its prime is to picture an axis of belief and statecraft. One might envision a Spartan commander, having made the long journey from the Peloponnesus, kneeling before the temple, waiting days or weeks for his audience. Offerings would be made, questions submitted. The Pythia's words, once received, would be carried back and debated in council. Decisions followed. Cities rose and fell on such words. And yet, rarely did anyone blame the oracle when things went wrong. The ambiguity protected her. The mystery endured. Over centuries, that influence ebbed and flowed, but it did not disappear. Even as Hellenistic kingdoms gave way to Roman authority, Delphi retained a kind of aura. Emperors paid their respects. Philosophers debated the nature of the god's speech. But the world was changing. Christianity, rising from the eastern provinces of the empire, offered a new relationship to the divine, one that placed truth in sacred texts, not ambiguous utterance. With the shift in belief came a shift in power. Pagan temples were closed, rituals banned, and the old god slowly receded from public life. Delphi did not fall in a single moment. Its decline was gradual, marked by fewer visitors, reduced offerings, and the eventual silencing of the Pythia's voice. By the 4th century CE, under Theodosius I, the temple was officially closed as part of the empire's move toward Christian orthodoxy. The sacred fire was extinguished. The god no longer spoke, but memory lingered. Even in silence, Delphi remained a symbol of mystery, of the human urge to seek meaning beyond reason, of the delicate balance between power and belief. In literature and later philosophy, the oracle became a motif, a reminder that knowledge is rarely absolute, and that guidance often comes cloaked in paradox. Her voice may have faded, but her presence in history was secure. Today, the ruins of Delphi still draw visitors. The columns lie broken. The theatre stands open to the sky. The tripod is gone. But the sense remains of a place where people once believed the divine could be consulted, if only in riddles. What made Delphi last was not certainty, but resonance. The idea that a god might speak through a mortal, and that such speech could shape empires, continues to fascinate. It tells us something essential about the world the Greeks built, and the questions they asked. In the end, The Oracle of Delphi was not a source of answers. She was a mirror of possibility. Her words did not predict so much as reveal the weight of decision. That so many were willing to listen and to act speaks not to naivety, but to the enduring human desire to connect the present with something larger, older, and more enduring than ourselves. In Delphi, they found that connection, and through her, the voice of the god. Chapter 5. The Prophecies of the Hopi. High on the mesas of what is now northeastern Arizona, the Hopi people have lived for more than 1,000 years, cultivating corn in arid soil, conducting ceremonies aligned with the seasons, and holding to traditions passed quietly through generations. Their villages, places like Old Oraibi and Hotevilla, are among the oldest continuously inhabited communities in North America. The Hopi identity is deeply tied to this continuity, not only in geography but in time. To live as Hopi, or Hopitu Shinumu, is to walk a path of humility, balance, and responsibility. It is a life woven into the cycles of nature and guided by teachings that have no clear beginning or end. For the Hopi, prophecy is not a tool to predict future headlines. It is not a dramatic unveiling of some fixed fate. Instead, it is a way of seeing the world's unfolding through patterns of imbalance and restoration. Time, in Hopi understanding, is not linear but cyclical, a great wheel turning through eras of harmony and disruption. Prophecy emerges from this rhythm, not as a threat, but as a reminder that choices matter, that actions echo across generations, and that forgetting sacred responsibilities can bring not punishment, but consequences. Among the most widely known Hopi prophecies, at least outside the community, is a series often called the 9 Signs. These were popularized in the latter half of the 20th century, reportedly based on the words of a Hopi elder named White Feather of the Bear Clan. According to this account, 9 specific events would unfold as markers of the end of the current world, or fourth world, and the beginning of a great purification. The first sign described the arrival of white-skinned people bearing thunder and lightning, a reference often understood as the arrival of European settlers with firearms. The second sign spoke of spinning wheels filling the land, interpreted as wagons or later automobiles. The third foretold of longhorn cattle, a vision that some link to the introduction of livestock by the Spanish. The signs continue in this pattern, each reflecting a historical shift: iron snakes crossing the land, seen as railroads, a giant spider web connecting the world, interpreted as the telegraph, or later, the Internet. One of the most often cited is the 7th sign, which speaks of the sea turning black and many creatures dying, evoking for some images of oil spills and environmental collapse. The 8th sign is perhaps the most haunting: a gourd of ashes falling from the sky, burning the land and boiling the rivers. Many have interpreted this as a reference to the atomic bomb dropped on Japan in 1945. And the 9th sign tells of a permanent dwelling in the sky, a detail that has been connected by some to the orbiting space station. Taken together, these 9 signs form a striking sequence. To many who first encountered them in books, lectures, or circulating internet posts, they seemed uncanny in their alignment with 20th century events. But the origin of this version is complicated. The account as we know it first appeared in non-Hopi publications. It was retold through a lens not always anchored in Hopi protocol or cultural context. The Hopi themselves traditionally transmit prophecy orally, in ceremony, through storytelling, and within specific familial or spiritual roles. These teachings are not broadcast broadly, nor are they written down casually. They are guarded, not as secrets, but as responsibilities. Not everything is meant to be shared with the outside world. This tension between oral tradition and written dissemination lies at the heart of the modern discourse around the 9 signs. While many elements of the prophecy may reflect genuine teachings, the way they have circulated, detached from their ceremonial grounding, paraphrased in English, often used to support unrelated spiritual ideologies, has raised questions of authenticity. Some Hopi elders have affirmed aspects of the prophecies when speaking in public forums. Others have expressed concern about how such teachings are misunderstood or misused. The problem is not only misrepresentation, but distortion through translation, cultural, linguistic, and spiritual. Yet, despite the uncertainty about specific wording or origin, the themes of the 9 signs resonate with broader, verifiable Hopi worldviews. Central to Hopi prophecy is the idea of Koyaanisqatsi, a Hopi word that roughly translates to life out of balance. It describes a world in disarray, where natural cycles are broken, and human conduct no longer honours the earth. Prophecies, in this view, are warnings, not declarations of doom, but urgent calls to realign with sacred obligations. The signs are less about prediction than about reflection. They describe what happens when harmony is lost, when greed outweighs gratitude, and when knowledge is severed from responsibility. The purification, a concept that appears in many Hopi teachings, is not portrayed as a divine punishment, but as a cleansing process. It is understood as something that comes not suddenly, but gradually, like a storm building at the horizon. It may involve fire, water, wind, or social upheaval, but its purpose is not annihilation. It is restoration. Through purification, the earth is rebalanced. Those who survive are those who live in accordance with the Hopi way, a path of humility, discipline, and care for the land. This is not an abstract ideal. It is rooted in daily practice, in agriculture, in ceremony, in kinship. The cornfields tended without machines, the songs sung to greet the dawn, the dances that mark each season. These are not performances. They are acts of participation in the ongoing life of the world. Within this framework, prophecy is not an invitation to passivity. It demands response. The teachings are clear in this regard. Humanity has agency. The outcome is not fixed. The signs do not guarantee collapse. They serve as reminders that we have been warned and that the path forward depends on choices made now. This is where Hopi prophecy differs profoundly from Western notions of fatalism or eschatology. It does not hand over the future to fate. It insists on responsibility. But as Hopi prophecies entered the global imagination, especially in the late 20th century, they were often stripped of this nuance. New Age movements in particular adopted the 9 signs and similar teachings as symbols of spiritual awakening or planetary transition. In these retellings, the Hopi became characters in a broader mythology, wise indigenous prophets, forecasting global change. While often well-intentioned, These interpretations frequently disconnected the teachings from their cultural roots. The Hopi were no longer participants in a living tradition, but mouthpieces for a universal message, one shaped more by outsider hopes and fears than by Hopi voices. This phenomenon of fascination turning into appropriation is not unique to the Hopi, but it is especially fraught in their case because of the care with which their traditions are held. Prophecy, for the Hopi, is not content to be consumed. It is a relationship. It lives in ceremony, in language, in land. To take the signs without the responsibilities they imply is to misunderstand them entirely. Still, it is worth asking why these prophecies continue to resonate. Part of the reason lies in their imagery, clear, symbolic and haunting. But more deeply, they reflect concerns that feel global in scope: environmental degradation, technological overreach, cultural fragmentation. They speak to a world that senses its disconnection, that feels the cost of forgetting its place within the natural order. For many listeners, indigenous and non-indigenous alike, the Hopi prophecies offer not just warning, but clarity. They frame the crisis not as chaos, but as imbalance. And in doing so, they suggest that balance is still possible. To understand the significance of these teachings is to understand that they are not historical curiosities. They are ongoing. The Hopi do not speak of the past as something sealed off. They speak of continuity, of the thread that links ancestors to descendants, ceremonies to seasons, choices to consequences. This is why the idea of the purification is not catastrophic. It is necessary, not a final act, but a turning, the end of one way of life, so that another might endure. That endurance is at the heart of the Hopi identity. Through centuries of pressure from colonization, missionary campaigns, federal policy, the Hopi have preserved their language, their agricultural methods, their ceremonial cycles. They have kept alive a way of being that does not treat prophecy as spectacle, but as guidance. And even as their teachings have been misquoted or misused, the core remains intact, protected, practiced, passed down. In listening to Hopi prophecy, one must listen with humility. It is not ours to own or redefine, but it is possible to learn from it, not through borrowed symbols, but through attention to its values. It speaks of a relationship with the earth that is not extractive, but reciprocal. It asks for patience, respect and memory. And above all, it insists that the future is not a secret locked in fate, but a path walked by choice. This, in the end, may be why the prophecies endure. Not because they predict events with cinematic precision, not because they offer comfort, but because they call us back, to the land, to each other, to a kind of listening that is deeper than curiosity. The Hopi have walked this path for generations. Their words, when truly heard, are not about endings. They are about remembering how to begin again. Chapter 6. The Book of Revelation. In the final pages of the Christian New Testament lies a text unlike any other. The Book of Revelation, also known as the Apocalypse of John, is at once a vision, a warning, and a puzzle, dense with imagery, numbers, beasts, angels, trumpets, and thrones. It closes the canon not with a summary or a farewell, but with a storm. Visions of heaven and hell, judgment and renewal, destruction and divine promise. For nearly 2,000 years, its meaning has been debated, its symbols reinterpreted, and its influence felt far beyond the boundaries of theology. Tradition holds that the author was a man named John, exiled to the small rocky island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea. He identifies himself simply as a servant of Christ, a witness to the Word of God. This was not the Apostle John of the Gospels. At least most scholars agree it was not, but another figure, likely a Christian prophet or elder living in the late 1st century CE. The Roman Empire at that time was not yet at full-scale war with Christianity, but tensions had risen. Persecutions, though sporadic and localized, were real. Christians who refused to worship the emperor or participate in Roman cults were seen as disloyal, even dangerous. For someone like John, exile was a form of suppression, a way to silence the voice without shedding blood. On Patmos, isolated from his community but spiritually alight, John received what he described as a revelation, a series of visions communicated through a divine intermediary. "I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day," he writes, and what followed was a sequence of dreamlike, often violent, sometimes majestic scenes that he recorded not as a story, but as a vision. The result is a book that resists linear reading. It is not a gospel, not a letter, not a parable. It is a symbolic landscape populated by cosmic conflict, ritual proclamation, and cyclical destruction. Revelation opens with messages to 7 churches in Asia Minor, real congregations in cities like Ephesus, Smyrna, and Laodicea. These messages offer both encouragement and rebuke. They warn against complacency, idolatry, and compromise with surrounding cultures. They are grounded in the immediate realities of these early Christian communities, but quickly give way to a series of increasingly surreal images. John is taken up in spirit to the heavenly throne room, where he sees 24 elders, 4 living creatures with wings and eyes, and a scroll sealed with 7 seals, a scroll that no one can open until the Lamb, a symbol of Christ, arrives. As each seal is broken, disasters are unleashed upon the earth. The 4 horsemen ride forth, conquest, war, famine, and death, each emblematic of the forces that erode civilizations. Trumpets sound, unleashing plagues and celestial disturbances. A beast rises from the sea with 7 heads and 10 horns. Another beast speaks like a dragon. The number 666 is given as the mark of the beast, a numerical riddle that has become one of the most infamous codes in religious literature. Babylon is personified as a harlot, dressed in scarlet and gold, drunk on the blood of the saints. She sits on many waters and is ultimately cast down, her destruction mourned by the kings and merchants of the earth. Yet after the judgment comes a new vision. A rider on a white horse, called Faithful and True, leads heavenly armies against evil. A final battle is waged, the dead are judged, and a new Jerusalem descends from heaven, a city of light, with gates of pearl and streets of gold, where there's no more death, mourning, or pain. The tree of life grows once more. The river of the water of life flows from the throne of God. Time itself seems to dissolve into eternity. Throughout the centuries, these images have been read in vastly different ways. Some interpret Revelation as a political allegory, written in veiled language to critique the Roman Empire. In this reading, the beast represents imperial power. The whore of Babylon symbolizes Rome's decadence, and the persecution of saints reflects the real dangers faced by early Christians. John, unable to speak openly, encodes his protest in the language of vision. Others, especially within later Christian traditions, read the book as a literal prophecy, a forecast of events yet to come, the rise of an antichrist, a global conflict, a final judgment. These interpretations see the text not as veiled critique, but as unveiled truth. This tension between metaphor and literalism has shaped the reception of Revelation for nearly 2 millennia. In the early church, its inclusion in the canon was not universally accepted. Some Christian leaders viewed its content as too obscure, too violent, or too open to misreading. Others embraced it as the perfect conclusion to a sacred story, offering a final vindication of justice and the promise of divine triumph. By the 4th century, it had been accepted into the canon in the West, though some Eastern churches remained hesitant. What is beyond doubt is the text's extraordinary impact. It has shaped Christian eschatology, the theology of last things, more than any other book. It gave rise to millenarian movements, which predicted the imminent return of Christ and the establishment of a 1,000-year reign. During times of crisis, plagues, wars, natural disasters, people turned to Revelation for answers, searching its symbols for clues to current events. In the Middle Ages, it inspired frescoes and illuminated manuscripts. In the Reformation, it fueled arguments about the papacy and empire. In the modern world, it has remained a cornerstone for evangelical interpretations of history and prophecy. But the influence of Revelation goes beyond religious doctrine. Its imagery has permeated art, literature, and politics. William Blake drew from its visions in his engravings. Martin Luther King Jr. echoed the words of the New Jerusalem in his famous dream of justice and peace. American political rhetoric has invoked its themes of good and evil, final battles, and redemption. The book's symbolic language, the beast, the mark, the 7 seals, has become cultural shorthand for disaster, tyranny, or the hope of deliverance. At the same time, the very elements that make Revelation compelling have made it controversial. Its violent tone, its often opaque symbolism, and its apocalyptic worldview have led to centuries of debate. Some readers have found in it a source of hope, that no matter how chaotic the world becomes, justice will prevail. Others have found in it a source of fear, anxiety, or confusion. For some traditions, it is a call to vigilance. For others, it is a text to be read cautiously, even metaphorically, lest it lead to obsession or distortion. In the modern era, Revelation continues to echo in unexpected ways. During the Cold War, its imagery was invoked in discussions of nuclear apocalypse. The idea of a fiery end to the world, with plagues, fire, and judgment, felt eerily aligned with the threat of mutually assured destruction. In times of pandemic, language of seals and trumpets has resurfaced in popular discourse. During political upheavals, the idea of Babylon falling or a beast gaining power reappears in both religious and secular rhetoric. But these echoes are not proof of prophecy fulfilled. They are reflections of how the text continues to frame the way we understand danger, authority, and the possibility of renewal. This adaptability is part of what makes Revelation enduring. It is not a static prediction, but a symbolic reservoir. Its strength lies not in precise forecasting, but in the way it mirrors human hopes and fears. It speaks to the longing for justice, the fear of oppression, the anticipation of transformation. Whether seen as political protest, divine vision, or mythic drama, Revelation offers a language for crisis, and for the hope that crisis is not the end of the story. Yet to truly understand Revelation is to approach it with care. It is not a code to be cracked, nor a blueprint to be mechanically followed. It is a vision, layered, poetic, and steeped in the imagery of Hebrew prophecy, Greco-Roman symbolism, and early Christian experience. Its meaning is not only in its symbols, but in its structure. The movement from judgment to restoration, from fear to promise. It offers no simple timeline. Instead, it offers patterns of fall and rise, corruption and purification, death and renewal. In the closing lines of the book, the author speaks directly to the reader. "Behold, I am coming soon," he writes in the voice of Christ. And then the Spirit and the bride say, "Come." The invitation is not only to fear, but to hope. The gates of the New Jerusalem are open. The river flows. The leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. The book of Revelation ends not in fire, but in invitation. That perhaps is its most overlooked aspect. For all its images of beasts and battle, its final word is not vengeance. It is renewal. And in that, it offers not only a vision of the end, but a vision of what might yet be restored. Chapter 7. The Prophecies of Mother Shipton. In the deep north of England, near the craggy banks of the River Nid, lies a limestone cave long known to locals and travellers alike. The place is damp and mineral-rich, surrounded by forest and stone. Today, it's part of a tourist trail in Knaresborough, Yorkshire, but its reputation reaches back centuries. It is said to be the birthplace of Ursula Seuthill, remembered by legend as Mother Shipton, the most famous prophetess in English folklore. The story goes that she was born during a thunderstorm in 1488, deformed in appearance and rejected by her village. Raised on the margins of society, she grew to be a figure both feared and consulted, a solitary woman with second sight. Whether any of that is true is difficult to say. What is clear is that her name became attached to a body of prophecies that would outlive her by centuries, and that the shape those prophecies took had as much to do with the time they were published as the time she is said to have lived. According to the earliest accounts, Ursula Seuthill was born to an unmarried woman named Agatha, who, unable to care for her child, left her near the cave. The child was reportedly grotesque in appearance, large-eyed, twisted-limbed, and was rumoured to be the product of a union with the devil. These were not neutral observations. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, England was a place where deformity was often read as divine sign or satanic mark. In such a context, a physically unusual girl growing up outside the normal bonds of family and church easily became the subject of suspicion. By the time the name Mother Shipton began to circulate, she had already been transformed in the public mind from a real woman, if she ever existed, into a figure of folklore, a witch-like seer, a local oracle, a vessel for predictions that spanned beyond her supposed village origins. The earliest printed references to Mother Shipton do not appear until the 17th century, decades after her supposed death in 1561. The first known pamphlet, published in 1641, was titled The Prophecy of Mother Shipton, in the reign of King Henry VIII, a thin, cheaply printed booklet that purported to record her visions in poetic form. This alone raised questions. Why had no such prophecies been circulated while she was alive? Why had they waited until a century marked by civil unrest, religious conflict, and public appetite for omens? The content of the prophecies varied widely, but shared a consistent tone. They were written in rhyming verse, often vaguely worded, and open to interpretation. Some lines were general warnings about moral decline or political instability. Others were startlingly specific, but only in hindsight. Among the most cited is the claim that the world to an end shall come. In 1881, that line, often attributed to her, was in fact added in the 19th century by a publisher named Charles Hindley, who later admitted to fabricating it. Other verses describe iron ships sailing without sails, carriages moving without horses, and people flying through the air like birds. These predictions have been retroactively tied to steamships, railways, and airplanes, though the language itself, once stripped of interpretation, remains general enough to invite multiple meanings. This pattern is familiar in the history of prophecy. When predictions are couched in metaphor or broad symbolism, they invite the reader to supply the meaning. Events can be matched to phrases not because the phrases foresaw them, but because the human mind excels at finding patterns, especially in hindsight. The same verse might be forgotten if it fails to match the times, or elevated if a match can be plausibly drawn. In this way, the power of the prophecy often lies not in its accuracy, but in its ambiguity. Mother Shipton's legend grew through such processes. She became a symbol of rural wisdom, a prophetic voice emerging not from the clergy or court, but from the wilds of Yorkshire. Later retellings embellished her story further, describing her physical form in grotesque terms, with a humped back, crooked nose, and piercing eyes, reinforcing the archetype of the outcast seer. In this, she echoed other legendary women in European folklore who were granted power through marginalization, feared for their difference, yet sought for their insight. But the prophecies themselves continued to evolve. In the 18th and 19th centuries, books claiming to contain Mother Shipton's prophecies entire and original were published in both England and America. Many of these editions added new material that reflected contemporary concerns. Predictions about Napoleon, the Industrial Revolution, and even the American Civil War began to appear. The fact that these events occurred well after her supposed death did not deter publishers or readers. On the contrary, the apparent foresight only increased public fascination. Historians have long suspected, and in many cases demonstrated, that much of what is attributed to Mother Shipton was written by others, often with commercial or political motives. In an age when cheap print was becoming widespread, prophecy sold. It provided drama, moral urgency, and the tantalizing possibility that history had been foretold. In times of unrest, people looked to oracles not just for comfort, but for confirmation that the chaos they lived through was part of a larger pattern. Mother Shipton, or the idea of her, served that role. Despite, or because of, the doubtful origins of her prophecies, she remained a fixture in English popular culture. Her cave, said to be the site of her birth, became a place of pilgrimage. Visitors came to see the petrifying well, where objects hung in dripping water slowly turned to stone. Souvenirs were sold. Her image, often caricatured with a hooked nose and pointed hat, appeared on posters, postcards, and almanacs. She was no longer just a folk figure. She was a brand. Yet even as her story was commercialized, it retained a trace of something older and harder to dismiss. The idea of a common woman, born in obscurity, speaking truths that echoed across centuries, appealed to those who distrusted official authority. She was not a scholar or a priest, not part of the established order. She was, or was imagined to be, someone who saw what others could not. Her words, however dubious in origin, continued to resonate because they tapped into recurring human questions. Are we heading toward ruin? Have we been warned? And if so, by whom? Some modern writers have grouped Mother Shipton with figures like Nostradamus, despite the vast difference in historical grounding. Nostradamus left behind a real body of writing, composed in his lifetime and widely circulated. Mother Shipton, by contrast, left no known writings during her life. Her prophecies appeared only after she had become a legend, a process that allowed her story to serve as a canvas for others' agendas, hopes, and fears. Still, the comparison persists because both figures operate within the same imaginative space. That borderland where prophecy meets folklore, where history becomes pliable, and where symbols take precedence over details. Like many such figures, Mother Shipton is both person and mirror, shaped by the people who remembered her and by the times in which those memories were reshaped. She was once a local curiosity, then a national figure, then an emblem of the prophetic voice from the margins. In recent decades, she has continued to appear in books on mysticism, alternative histories, and conspiracy theories. Her supposed predictions are quoted online, often without reference to their dubious provenance. The line between fact and legend has long since blurred. For many, it no longer matters whether she said the words attributed to her. What matters is that they feel relevant or timely, or somehow true. The endurance of Mother Shipton's myth reveals more about cultural appetite than historical record. Her story thrives not on verification, but on suggestion. The cave in Knaresborough still draws visitors. The figure of the seer, part witch, part prophet, part warning, remains potent. She speaks to a desire for meaning in times of change, for signs amid uncertainty, and for the idea that someone, somewhere, saw it all coming. Ultimately, the prophecies of Mother Shipton are best understood not as a chronicle of events foretold, but as a testament to the power of story, especially when wrapped in the cloak of mystery. They illustrate how easily legend can be adapted to fit the present, and how the language of prophecy, poetic, cryptic, evocative, lends itself to reinterpretation across generations. The figure at the centre of it all may be more symbol than self, but that, too, is part of prophecy's peculiar legacy. It is not always the source that gives it strength. It is the silence that surrounds the words, and what others choose to fill that silence with. Chapter 8. The I Ching. The I Ching, often translated as the Book of Changes, stands among the oldest continuous intellectual traditions in human history. Its roots stretch back to ancient China, at least as far as the late 3rd millennium BCE, and perhaps earlier. It began not as a philosophical treatise, but as a divinatory manual, a practical tool for discerning meaning from the ebb and flow of nature. Over time, this book of hexagrams, would become a cornerstone of Chinese culture, embraced by rulers and scholars alike, not because it predicted events in the way modern minds expect of prophecy, but because it modelled how to understand movement, process, and transformation. It revealed the character of time, and in doing so, asked those who consulted it to act in accordance with it. At its most basic level, the I Ching is a system of 64 figures, called hexagrams. Each hexagram consists of 6 horizontal lines stacked vertically. These lines are either broken, representing the yielding, receptive quality of yin, or unbroken, representing the firm, active quality of yang. The structure is binary, though its implications are not. Each hexagram represents a situation, a tendency, a moment within a larger cycle. It is not a label for what will happen, but a reflection of how things are currently configured, and what may emerge from that configuration if one acts wisely or not at all. To consult the I Ching is to participate in an interpretive act. In traditional practice, the process involved the casting of yarrow stalks, a ritualized method of generating numbers that determine the combination of lines. In later centuries, coins were used for the same purpose. The outcome of the casting would form a single hexagram. This figure would then be matched to a written entry in the book, which contained a series of judgments, images, and line-specific commentaries. These passages offered a layered reading, symbolic, moral, situational, shaped both by the text and by the circumstances of the person asking. The I Ching did not offer simple answers. It was not consulted to name a specific outcome, but to reveal the conditions surrounding a choice. Its language was metaphorical, often poetic, designed to prompt reflection. One might be told that the superior man acts with caution, like one walking on thin ice, or that the time is favourable for crossing the great river. These statements require interpretation. The wisdom of the I Ching lies not in a fixed truth, but in how it fosters alignment between the decision-maker and the rhythm of unfolding events. During the Zhou dynasty, which began around 1046 BCE, the I Ching evolved beyond its original shamanic context. It was refined, annotated, and elevated. The hexagrams were paired with philosophical commentary, which deepened their resonance and gave them a wider range of application. This period saw the beginning of what would become known as the 10 Wings. Interpretive texts added to the original hexagram statements. These layers of commentary offered moral, social, and cosmic perspectives on the core symbols. Over time, the I Ching became not only a manual for diviners, but a guide for rulers, advisors, and thinkers. Its influence on Chinese governance was profound. Emperors and court officials turned to the Thrasher Ching in moments of uncertainty, not to surrender to fate, but to seek insight. Decisions regarding war, diplomacy, agriculture, and reform were sometimes framed by the patterns revealed in consultation. The logic behind this practice was not magical. It stemmed from a worldview in which nature and human affairs were seen as interconnected, governed by underlying patterns of change. To understand the nature of a moment, its balance of forces, its direction of movement, was to act with greater harmony, and thus greater effectiveness. The I Ching's philosophical power came from its embrace of change as the central fact of existence. Nothing, in its view, is fixed. The world is composed of interdependent opposites, light and dark, motion and stillness, strength and softness. These forces are not in conflict, but in dynamic balance. Yin becomes yang, yang becomes yin. The hexagrams do not capture static conditions, but transitional states. Each line within a hexagram can shift, transforming one figure into another. This fluidity mirrors life itself, where clarity is temporary and certainty is rare. Confucian thinkers recognized the ethical dimensions of this system. For them, the I Ching became a guide to moral action, a way of cultivating virtue by understanding the demands of time and place. Confucius himself is traditionally credited with writing commentary on the I Ching, though this attribution, like many, is debated. What is known is that the Confucian tradition integrated the I Ching into its canon, treating it as a text of wisdom rather than superstition. It was not about escaping responsibility, but understanding how best to fulfill it. At the same time, Taoist philosophers found in the I Ching a validation of their own emphasis on natural flow, non-interference, and inner attunement. Where Confucians read the hexagrams as lessons in ethical responsibility, Taoists read them as reminders of nature's rhythm. The importance of timing, yielding, and emptying oneself of fixed agendas. In this way, the I Ching held a unique place in Chinese thought. It could be read as moral instruction, spiritual counsel, or practical strategy. It contained no dogma. It asked questions more than it gave answers. Over centuries, the I Ching's influence spread into nearly every corner of Chinese life. Its logic shaped theories of medicine, where balance between forces governed diagnosis and treatment. It informed feng shui, the practice of arranging space in accordance with natural energy. It shaped martial arts, where movement flows in response to conditions, not against them. And in literature, politics, and daily ritual, the I Ching remained present, not as a relic, but as a living system of awareness. In the 20th century, the I Ching reached a global audience through translation. One of the most influential versions was published in 1924 by Richard Wilhelm, a German sinologist who had studied in China. His translation, based on traditional commentaries, was prefaced by the Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Jung, who found in the I Ching a profound resonance with his own theory of synchronicity. The idea that events can be connected by meaning rather than cause. Jung believed that consulting the I Ching revealed patterns not because the book caused outcomes, but because it mirrored the structure of the psyche, offering symbolic language for the unconscious mind. This perspective helped position the I Ching in Western consciousness as a psychological tool, rather than a mystical oracle. Writers, artists, and thinkers began to use it not for prediction, but for insight. Its poetic language and layered structure made it attractive to those seeking creative or philosophical prompts. In a time when traditional religion was losing ground among some intellectuals, the I Ching offered a form of spiritual exploration that did not require belief, only attention. Some modern readers have drawn attention to the structural elegance of the I Ching's hexagrams. The binary construction, lines either broken or unbroken, anticipates the logic of digital code. There are 64 possible hexagrams, and there are 64 codons in the genetic code, each corresponding to a triplet of nucleotides. These parallels are intriguing, though coincidental. The creators of the I Ching were not encoding biological systems or programming languages. But the structural symmetry has fueled a sense of wonder, and for some, it suggests that the I Ching speaks to something deeply embedded in the architecture of order and variation. What is essential to understand is that the I Ching is not prophecy in the sense of predicting singular events. It does not claim to foretell the future with specificity. Instead, it offers a way to understand the present, to read the currents beneath the surface, to discern when to act and when to wait. Its wisdom lies in its refusal to simplify. It teaches that timing matters, that forces are always in motion, and that wise action requires alignment with circumstance. In that sense, it is profoundly pragmatic. To consult the I Ching is to ask, what is the character of this moment? What kind of change is occurring? What posture is appropriate, assertive, receptive, cautious, bold? It does not promise outcomes. It encourages preparation. For this reason, the I Ching has remained relevant across dynasties, cultures, and ideologies. It does not belong to any one belief system. It is a lens, not a creed. Its endurance is not due to the certainty it offers, but to the discipline it requires. The willingness to reflect, to interpret, and to respond with care.
Whether used by emperors planning campaigns, scholars seeking moral clarity, or modern readers looking for direction, the I Ching remains what it has always been, a mirror of change and a guide for those willing to look into it.
Chapter 9. The Prophecy of the Popes. In the long and intricate history of the Roman Catholic Church, few documents have inspired as much enduring fascination and as much doubt as the so-called Prophecy of the Popes. Said to consist of 112 Latin mottos, each corresponding to a future pope, the list has been linked to everything from quiet curiosity to eschatological fear. Some believe it maps the papacy from the 12th century through to the very end of the Church as an institution. Others regard it as a clever forgery, designed for political advantage at a crucial moment in Church history. And yet, the list continues to be cited, dissected, and believed in certain circles. Not because it has been proven accurate, but because it exists at the intersection of faith, secrecy, and the age-old desire to know how the story ends. The list is attributed to Saint Malachy, an Irish archbishop who lived in the 12th century and was later canonized. Born in 1094, Malachy served as Archbishop of Armagh and was known during his lifetime as a reformer and miracle worker. According to the legend that later emerged, Malachy made a pilgrimage to Rome in 1139, during which he received a divine vision. In this vision, he saw all the popes who would succeed from his own time until the end of the Church. For each, he wrote down a short Latin phrase, not a name, but a cryptic motto, often symbolic, geographical, or metaphorical. The list reportedly ended with a final pope, marked by ominous language. After returning to Ireland, Malachy was said to have delivered this manuscript to Pope Innocent II, whereupon it was placed in the Vatican archives and forgotten for centuries. The document did not surface again until 1595, more than 400 years later. At that time, it was published by Arnold Wyon, a Benedictine historian, in his book Lignum Vitae. The timing was noteworthy. The Church was preparing for a new papal election following the death of Pope Urban VII, and political manoeuvring within the College of Cardinals was intense. Among the candidates was Cardinal Girolamo Simoncelli, whose supporters believed his election could be aided by prophetic endorsement. When the prophecy was made public, it just so happened that the motto attached to the next pope, ex antiquitate urbis, meaning from the antiquity of the city, seemed to describe Simoncelli, who had close ties to ancient Rome. Despite this apparent alignment, Simoncelli was not elected. But the document, once revealed, had already caught the public's imagination. Each line of the prophecy is brief, typically no more than a few words. Yet over the centuries, these phrases have been interpreted and retrofitted to align with specific popes. For example, De Meditate Lunae, from the half moon, has been linked to Pope John Paul III, who served for only 33 days, roughly the length of a lunar cycle. Pastor et Nauta, shepherd and sailor, was tied to John the 23rd, who had served as Patriarch of Venice, a city defined by its waterways and maritime history. De Labore Solis, from the labour of the sun, was connected to John Paul II, who was born and buried during solar eclipses. These interpretations, while intriguing, are often applied after the fact. The mottos are vague enough to allow considerable flexibility, and in many cases the connections require creative leaps. Still, the belief persists among some readers that the list is, if not divinely inspired, then at least remarkably prescient, especially for the popes who reigned before the prophecy was published. That distinction is important. Supporters of the prophecy often point to the early mottos as uncannily accurate, but critics argue that those early entries could have been crafted with historical knowledge, carefully tailored to match the lives and symbols of already known popes. From the 1590s onward, the correspondences become noticeably less convincing. The descriptions are broader, the matches more tenuous. Some popes seem to fit their mottos only by coincidence, and others not at all. This shift in quality and clarity has led many scholars to suspect forgery. The most widely accepted theory is that the list was created in the late 16th century, not by Saint Malachy, but by a supporter of Simoncelli, possibly even by Wyon himself. In this reading, the prophecy was not an authentic vision, but a piece of strategic propaganda, intended to guide the outcome of a papal conclave. If so, it failed in its immediate purpose, but succeeded in creating a legend. The idea that a single list might contain a complete map of the Church's future, extending to the very end, proved too compelling to ignore. The final entry on the list is unlike the rest. It departs from the pattern of brief, symbolic mottos, and instead contains a longer and more ominous description. It reads, In persecution extrema SRE, sedebit Petrus Romanus, qui pasce oves in multis tribulationibus, quibus transactis, civitas septicolis diruetur, et judex tremedus judicabit populum sum. Finis. Translated, it means, in the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church, there shall sit Peter the Roman, who shall feed the flock through many tribulations, after which the city of 7 hills shall be destroyed, and the dreadful judge shall judge his people. The end. This passage has been the subject of intense scrutiny. Some take it as a literal forecast of the end of the papacy and the Church, or even the world itself. Others view it as symbolic, a vision of crisis rather than collapse. The mention of Peter the Roman is especially curious. No pope since the original Peter has taken that name, perhaps out of reverence, perhaps out of superstition. If the prophecy is to be taken as a sequence, then the current pope, Francis, would be the last before this Peter the Roman, or possibly even identified as him. The ambiguity has fueled speculation, particularly in times of political or ecclesiastical tension. The elections of recent popes, especially those of John Paul II, Benedict XVI and Francis, were accompanied by renewed interest in the prophecy. Books and articles circulated, drawing connections between the mottos and contemporary events. Some commentators suggested that Pope Francis, with his emphasis on humility and his outsider status as the first Jesuit and first Latin American pope, might be the final figure on the list, not named Peter, but Roman in spirit. Others argued that one more pope remains, and that the final entry has yet to be fulfilled. Importantly, the Catholic Church has never recognized the prophecy as legitimate. It is not included in official doctrine. No papal documents endorse it. Scholars within and outside the Church have examined its origins and found no convincing evidence that it predates the 1590s. The absence of any mention for more than 4 centuries after Malachi's death casts serious doubt on its authenticity. In the Church's view, faith is not built on secret predictions, but on scripture and tradition. Yet the list endures. It is cited in fringe media, conspiracy theories, and popular books on prophecy. It appears in discussions about the fate of the Church, especially during moments of scandal or global unrest. The prophecy functions less as a guide to specific events and more as a mirror of anxiety, reflecting concerns about institutional decline, moral decay, or the future of religious authority. Its vagueness is part of its appeal. It offers just enough structure to seem meaningful, but enough ambiguity to remain open to reinterpretation. The endurance of the prophecy of the popes is not in the end about the precision of its claims. It survives because it touches something deeper, the desire to see history as ordered, to imagine that even chaos follows a plan. In a tradition where continuity is sacred, where apostolic succession is central to identity, a list that claims to chart the course from the beginning to the end carries immense symbolic weight. It binds the past to the future, even if the link is fragile. Like many enduring prophecies, it tells us more about those who read it than about those it describes. It invites belief, not by force of evidence, but by force of pattern. The same tendency that draws constellations in stars and meaning in coincidence. It is unlikely that Saint Malachi ever wrote the list. It is unlikely that the future popes of the Church were foreseen in the 12th century. But the fact that this legend, shaped by politics and sustained by imagination, continues to be retold, shows how prophecy, even when suspect, can still shape how people think about institutions, leadership, and the end of things. Whether dismissed as a pious fraud or held as a warning yet to unfold, the prophecy of the popes remains one of the most enduring pieces of ecclesiastical law. Its mottos, once intended, perhaps, as political persuasion, have outlived their immediate context. And in that persistence, they continue to raise the same question that echoes through so many prophetic traditions. What happens at the end? And how will we know when we've reached it? Chapter 10. The Enochian Prophecies. In the late 16th century, during the reign of Elizabeth I, two men began a series of spiritual experiments that would leave a curious and lasting imprint on the Western esoteric tradition. One was John Dee, a learned scholar, mathematician, and court astrologer, a man whose intellect ranged across the known sciences and into the realms of the mystical. The other was Edward Kelly, an alchemist and scryer, less reputable in scholarly circles, but indispensable to the process that unfolded. Together, they claimed to have received communications from angels, messages delivered through visions, coded language, and symbols that, they said, held the key to understanding divine order and future cataclysms. These sessions, recorded meticulously in Dee's diaries, would later be known as the Enochian Revelations, a system of angelic magic and prophecy that remains one of the most complex and controversial in the history of Western occultism. John Dee was not an obscure mystic working in the shadows. He was among the most prominent intellectuals of his day. Born in 1527, he studied at Cambridge, travelled widely in Europe, and developed a reputation as a man of deep knowledge. He advised Queen Elizabeth I on matters of astrology and navigation, and his library at Mortlake was one of the most extensive in England. Dee was a mathematician and a cartographer, but his interests extended far beyond the material sciences. He was deeply influenced by the Hermetic and Neoplatonic currents of Renaissance thought, which saw no contradiction between science and the sacred. In his worldview, mathematics and geometry revealed the divine architecture of the universe, and the heavens were not distant metaphors, but active, intelligent realms. He sought not only knowledge, but unity with the divine will, a goal he believed could be approached through spiritual contact. Edward Kelly entered Dee's life in 1582, bringing with him both potential and risk. A man of uncertain background and checkered reputation, Kelly had been accused of necromancy and forgery, and he wore a cap supposedly to conceal the loss of his ears, allegedly cut off as punishment for a criminal offence. Yet despite these marks against him, Kelly possessed a talent for scrying, the act of receiving visions while gazing into a reflective surface. Dee, who had tried other scryers without success, found in Kelly a conduit for the messages he had long sought. Though their temperaments were very different, Dee methodical and devout, Kelly volatile and self-interested, their partnership soon became central to one of the strangest episodes in the intellectual history of early modern Europe. Their method was structured and detailed. Dee would prepare the session through prayer and ritual purification, often invoking divine protection and aligning himself with Christian humility. Kelly, meanwhile, would enter a trance-like state while gazing into a crystal ball or a darkened mirror. Through this medium, he claimed to see angelic figures who would communicate messages, sometimes spoken in English, sometimes in an unknown tongue. Dee would record every word, often with exacting precision, filling hundreds of pages with transcriptions, diagrams, and commentaries. Over the course of several years, the two men generated an entire symbolic system, complete with a distinct grammar, syntax, and alphabet, which they believed to be the original language of the angels. This language was later called Enochian, after the biblical patriarch Enoch, who was said to have walked with God and to have been taken into heaven without dying. According to certain apocryphal texts, Enoch had been entrusted with divine secrets. Dee and Kelly believed they were recovering that lost knowledge, restored now through their angelic interlocutors. The Enochian language they documented was unlike anything previously encountered. It included its own script, with unique letters and phonetics, and a set of elaborate tables, known as the Tables of the Watchtowers, that organized spiritual hierarchies and domains of power. The language had grammar rules and syntax, though its practical use has never been independently verified. Nonetheless, the complexity and internal consistency of the material were striking, even to skeptics. The content of the angelic communications extended far beyond linguistic invention. The angels reportedly delivered visions of cosmic structure, end times prophecy, and the hidden forces shaping human history. They described a vast spiritual hierarchy populated by angels and spirits, each with specific roles and attributes. The revelations included apocalyptic warnings of wars between nations, the fall of empires, and a final battle between celestial and demonic powers. The angels spoke of threats to Christendom, and of a divine plan that would unfold through purification, conflict, and ultimate judgment. These were not vague mysticisms. They were often framed with urgency, couched in eschatological terms that reflected the theological anxieties of the Reformation era. As the sessions progressed, the demands of the angels became increasingly elaborate. Dee and Kelly were instructed to construct magical instruments, inscribe sacred names, and follow precise ceremonial protocols. These tasks often mirrored existing traditions of ceremonial magic, but the angels insisted that theirs was a higher, purer form, authorized by God, not drawn from older occult sources. Dee, ever the dutiful recorder, complied with these demands as best he could. Yet the growing complexity and moral strain of the instructions began to wear on both men. One moment in particular strained the entire endeavor to the breaking point. In 1587, the angels gave a shocking command. Dee and Kelly were to share their wives, a directive that they were told symbolized the abandonment of earthly attachments and submission to divine will. Dee, then in his 60s and deeply devoted to his wife Jane, was distraught. Kelly, who was increasingly skeptical of the sessions himself, resisted. But eventually, under spiritual pressure and emotional exhaustion, they complied. The consequences were immediate and lasting. Their personal relationships fractured, their trust in the angelic sources faltered, and their partnership began to dissolve. The event remains one of the most disturbing in the Enochian saga, illustrating how the boundary between revelation and manipulation, whether psychological or interpersonal, was never entirely clear. The question of authenticity has shadowed the Enochian system ever since. Some have defended Dee as a sincere seeker, a man of his time, earnestly pursuing divine truth through the tools available to him. His diaries reveal not a charlatan, but a man burdened by responsibility and humbled by what he believed to be a sacred task. Others see the visions as the product of Kelly's theatrical skill, a blend of invention, intuition, and opportunism, feeding Dee's hunger for spiritual contact. Still others interpret the entire episode through the lens of psychology, viewing the angels not as supernatural beings, but as projections of the unconscious mind, shaped by religious imagery and cultural expectation. What is beyond dispute is the intricacy of the system itself. The Enochian materials, the language, the tables, the cosmology, are among the most elaborate constructions in the history of early modern mysticism. Whether they emerged from revelation, deception, or imagination, their coherence and detail are extraordinary. Dean Kelly produced not fragments, but a framework, one that would later be rediscovered and adapted by new generations of esoteric thinkers. For several centuries after Dee's death, the Enochian documents were largely forgotten. His writings, scattered and often uncatalogued, remained in manuscript form, with only a few scholars aware of their existence. That changed in the late 19th century, when members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a secret society dedicated to the study of ceremonial magic, began to study and incorporate Enochian material into their rituals. They saw in Dee's system a genuine link to angelic intelligence and cosmic order. Aleister Crowley, the controversial occultist and former Golden Dawn initiate, further expanded the use of Enochian workings, developing new rituals and visionary techniques that drew heavily from the original diaries. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the system has remained a central reference in Western esotericism, not as a fixed doctrine, but as a deep symbolic reservoir. Today, Enochian studies span academic research, occult practice, and historical reconstruction. Scholars have examined these notebooks as primary sources in the history of Renaissance thought, while practitioners continue to test the system's spiritual and psychological dimensions. Few claim certainty about its origins. The sessions may reflect visionary truth, theatrical invention, or collaborative delusion. But in the long arc of prophetic literature, the Enochian prophecies occupy a distinct space, neither a traditional religious text nor a simple fraud, but something more ambiguous, shaped by intellect, belief, and the shifting line between what we imagine and what we record. The story of Dean Kelly is not only about angels and symbols, it is also about the risks of seeking ultimate knowledge and the costs of trusting intermediaries. It shows how the pursuit of prophecy can bind reason to vision, and how the desire for divine order can invite both inspiration and deception. Whatever the source of the Enochian prophecies, they remain one of the most unusual attempts in Western history to construct a complete, otherworldly language, and to use it not to predict events in time, but to make sense of the architecture behind time itself. Chapter 11. The Zoroastrian Saoshyant Prophecy. Among the oldest continuous religious traditions in the world, Zoroastrianism emerged in ancient Persia long before the rise of Islam, Christianity, or even classical Judaism. It shaped empires, ethics, and eschatologies, leaving a deep imprint on the spiritual and philosophical history of West and Central Asia. At the center of its cosmology is a stark but ordered dualism, a universe defined by the eternal tension between truth and falsehood, light and darkness, creation and corruption. These forces are not abstract metaphors, but named realities. On one side stands Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, source of all that is good, true, and life-giving. On the other, Angra Mainyu, or Ahriman, the destructive spirit, whose essence is deceit, death, and disorder. Human beings, in this cosmology, are not bystanders. They are participants in a cosmic struggle whose outcome, though ultimately destined for good, depends in part on their choices. Within this worldview, the future is not an open-ended continuation of the present. It has a shape. History, while stained by conflict, moves toward a final resolution. Evil, though potent, is not eternal. It will be overcome, not simply by divine fiat, but through the interplay of divine intention and human action. This is where the figure of the Saoshyant appears, a promised Redeemer, born in the final age, who will lead the last and decisive campaign against the forces of darkness. His coming marks not only a turning point in cosmic history, but the threshold of a new and incorruptible world. The term Saoshyant derives from an Avestan root meaning one who brings benefit or one who will save. In early texts, the word could be applied more generally to righteous individuals, those who advanced the cause of truth and helped fulfill the divine order. Over time, however, it took on a more specific meaning. The Saoshyant became not just a type, but a person, a singular eschatological figure who would appear at the end of time to complete the work begun by the prophet Zarathustra, also known by his Greek name, Zoroaster. According to Zoroastrian tradition, Zarathustra was the first to reveal the truth of Ahura Mazda and to expose the lies of Angra Mainyu. His teachings called for moral clarity, ritual discipline, and an unwavering commitment to the principles of Asha, truth, order, and righteousness. But even his revelation was not the final chapter. Evil would not be defeated in his lifetime, nor even in the generations that followed. Instead, the world would pass through successive epochs, each one marked by intensifying trials and mounting moral tests. At the end of these ages, when the world had nearly exhausted its strength, the Saoshyant would come, born of a miraculous union, foreseen by the wise, and destined to renew creation itself. The earliest references to the Saoshyant appear in the Younger Avesta, a portion of the Zoroastrian scripture composed in the later centuries of the first millennium BCE. These passages hint at a future deliverer who will lead the righteous, defeat the evil spirit, and inaugurate an age of resurrection and final judgment. The Yashts, poetic hymns to divine beings, refer to this Saviour in veiled language, emphasizing both his connection to Zarathustra and his role in purifying the world. Later texts, especially the Middle Persian or Pahlavi writings compiled in the Sasanian period and afterward, expand these ideas into a fuller eschatological narrative. Here we see the development of a trilogy of saviours. Three Saoshyants who appear at intervals, each born from the preserved seed of Zarathustra, miraculously sustained in the waters of Lake Kansava. Of these, the third and final Saoshyant is the great world renewer, the one who brings not only judgment, but restoration. The vision presented in these later sources is sweeping. In the final age, evil will rise in its most desperate form, corrupting nations, defiling sacred things, and spreading violence across the earth. The Saoshyant will emerge during this time of crisis, gathering the righteous and revealing the true path to salvation. He will preside over the resurrection of the dead, a bodily rising, not a symbolic one, and usher in a great reckoning. Each soul will pass through a river of molten metal, which will burn the wicked but purify the just. This trial is not arbitrary punishment, but a final cleansing. What remains is incorruptible. What follows is a perfected world. No death, no lies, no hunger or decay. Time itself is overcome. Creation is restored to the harmony intended from the beginning. Yet Zoroastrian eschatology is not passive. The promise of the Saoshyant is not an excuse for waiting. It is a call to ethical vigilance. From its earliest formulations, Zoroastrianism has emphasized individual responsibility. To follow the path of Asha is to side with creation against chaos, to speak truth against falsehood, to act justly even when the world does not. The final renewal in this tradition is not merely a divine imposition. It is the fruit of human participation. The Saoshyant does not arrive to solve what others have ignored. He comes when the accumulated efforts of the righteous across generations have reached their decisive moment. Salvation in this vision is collective and earned. This ethical dimension may help explain the durability and influence of Zoroastrian eschatology. Its framework of cosmic dualism and moral struggle found resonance in neighboring cultures, especially during the period of Persian imperial dominance in the ancient Near East. When the Babylonian Empire fell to Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, the Jewish population exiled in Babylon came under Persian rule. The influence of Zoroastrian ideas during this period remains a subject of scholarly debate, but the parallels are difficult to ignore. After the exile, Jewish texts begin to reflect more developed concepts of a final judgment, a resurrection of the dead, and the appearance of a messianic figure. These elements, largely absent from earlier Hebrew scriptures, take on increasing importance in apocalyptic writings of the Second Temple period. From there, the line continues. Christianity, with its doctrine of the Messiah, the Second Coming and the new heaven and earth, echoes these themes with striking fidelity. In Islam, the figure of the Mahdi, a guided one who appears before the end of days to restore justice, carries forward similar expectations. Across all three traditions, we find a saviour who emerges during tribulation, defeats the forces of falsehood, raises the dead, and renews the world. These are not mere coincidences. They are signs of shared eschatological architecture, shaped by centuries of contact, adaptation, and spiritual reflection. But if the Saoshyant once stood at the centre of a widespread vision of cosmic renewal, his role in the modern world is more subdued. Today, Zoroastrianism survives as a minority faith, practiced by small communities in Iran and the diaspora, notably in India, where the Parsi maintain religious continuity under often challenging conditions. Among these communities, the Saoshyant remains a revered figure, but less a topic of speculation than a symbol of enduring hope. Few expect his imminent arrival. There is no formal prophecy outlining timelines or worldly signs. Instead, the figure serves as a reminder of the ultimate moral arc of creation, that truth will prevail, that justice matters, and that the long struggle against falsehood is neither forgotten nor in vain. For some modern Zoroastrians, the Saoshyant is read not literally, but as an emblem of inner transformation or collective awakening. His arrival is not a date on a calendar, but a process already underway in the choices people make, to uphold truth, to resist cruelty, to act in accordance with the principles Zarathustra first revealed. Others maintain a more traditional belief, awaiting a future Redeemer who will complete the work of restoration. In both readings, the prophecy remains alive. not in public discourse, but in private conviction, in the rituals that affirm order, and in the ethical teachings passed from one generation to the next. What makes the Saoshyant prophecy significant, especially in a broader history of prophetic thought, is its early articulation of ideas that would become central to religious eschatology worldwide. It envisions a world not abandoned by its creator, but redeemed through fidelity and struggle. It offers a vision of justice that does not erase suffering, but transforms it. And it locates human beings not as victims of fate, but as co-workers in the unfolding of a divine plan. In this way, the Saoshyant is not only a figure of the end, he is a mirror of the beginning, the culmination of what Zarathustra called for, a life of good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. The Saoshyant may never have become a household name outside Zoroastrian circles, but his legacy, shaped over centuries of transmission and reflection, continues to influence how cultures imagine the final chapters of history. He belongs to a lineage of savior figures who promise that evil is not the final word, that time is moving toward reconciliation, and that even the most broken aspect of the world can be made whole. That vision, first recorded in the hymns and prayers of ancient Persia, remains one of humanity's most enduring hopes, that the struggle has meaning, and that the light, however dimmed, will prevail in the end. Chapter 12. The Egyptian Prophecy of Neferti. The prophecy of Neferti stands as one of the earliest known examples of a prophetic text crafted not to foretell a distant future, but to shape the political present. Composed during Egypt's Middle Kingdom, most likely under the reign of Amenemhat of Fetshur, in the early 12th dynasty, it uses the voice of a venerable sage to project a vision of chaos, collapse, and eventual restoration. On the surface, it reads as a dire prediction spoken centuries earlier in the court of Pharaoh Sneferu. But the true purpose of the text lies not in its supposed antiquity, but in its careful orchestration of authority, fear, and legitimacy. It is, at its core, a sophisticated political work cloaked in the language of divine foresight. The historical setting into which the prophecy of Neferti was introduced was one of instability and reinvention. The preceding First Intermediate period had seen Egypt fractured into competing regional powers, with central authority diminished and old norms upended. Amenemhat I, the founder of the 12th dynasty, came to power not through direct royal succession, but as a man of uncertain origin, possibly a vizier under his predecessor, who seized the throne in a time of uncertainty. In such a context, establishing legitimacy was more than a matter of military control. It required divine sanction, historical resonance, and the appearance of restoring what had been lost. The prophecy of Neferti offered all of these in a single, elegantly composed document. Framed as a recollection from Egypt's Old Kingdom, the prophecy opens in the court of Sneferu, a pharaoh of the 4th dynasty revered for his architectural achievements and peaceful reign. Feeling bored, the king requests entertainment and is advised to summon Neferti, a wise man known for his powers of perception. When the sage appears, he is asked to speak not of the present, but of what is to come. Neferti obliges, painting a bleak vision of Egypt's future, one marked by inversion, confusion, and calamity. The land, he says, will be overrun by foreigners. The Nile will run dry. The natural order will collapse. the people will suffer under lawlessness, and truth will be obscured. The very concept of Ma'at, the fundamental principle of cosmic and social harmony, will vanish from daily life. This portrait of a world in disarray serves more than one purpose. On the literary level, it echoes the Egyptian genre of lamentation and order in chaos narratives, wherein a period of turmoil is followed by the arrival of a saviour who restores balance. On the political level, it creates a vivid contrast between a time of imagined catastrophe and the present reign, positioning the current ruler as the answer to an age-old crisis. The heart of the prophecy arrives when Neferti foretells the coming of a king from the south, a ruler born in Upper Egypt, who will arise when the country is at its lowest point. This figure, unnamed but described with phrases that echo royal epithets, will act decisively. He will smite enemies, secure borders, and restore the temples. The priests will return to their duties, offerings will resume, and Ma'at will once again structure the lives of Egyptians. The land will be renewed not only through conquest, but through divine justice. Although the prophecy places this restoration in a nebulous future, there is little ambiguity about its intended reference. Modern scholars broadly agree that the king from the south is a transparent stand-in for Amenemhat himself, who had recently founded the 12th dynasty and relocated the capital to a newly constructed city in the north. By placing a prophecy in the mouth of an old kingdom sage and retroactively pointing to a saviour now on the throne, the text lent divine weight to a regime that otherwise lacked the straightforward hereditary credentials of its predecessors. This strategy of casting present events as fulfillments of ancient predictions is not unique to Egypt, but the prophecy of Neferti is among the earliest surviving instances where it is so clearly employed. The rhetorical power of such a device lies in its circular logic. If the sage foresaw the ruler, and the ruler has come to pass, then his rule must be ordained by destiny. It recasts a politically disruptive moment as a long-anticipated course correction. What might otherwise be interpreted as a seizure of power is reframed as the fulfillment of divine will. But the prophecy of Neferti is more than a piece of propaganda. Its construction is literary, careful, and evocative. Written in elevated poetic language, the text does not read as a plain announcement or list of events. It is stylized, possibly intended for recitation or ceremonial performance. The use of parallelism, metaphor, and stark contrast between chaos and order adds depth to its message. The vivid imagery of rivers that cease to flow, lands devoured by foreigners, and truth cast aside, taps into deep cultural anxieties about the loss of structure and tradition. In this way, the text does not simply instruct its audience on whom to follow. It evokes a shared emotional landscape of fear and longing, and then satisfies that longing with the promise of a Redeemer. The themes within the prophecy also align with Egypt's broader worldview. In Egyptian cosmology, the notion of Ma'at, both as a cosmic force and a societal ideal, was central. When Ma'at was upheld, Egypt thrived. The Nile flooded predictably, crops were abundant, foreigners were kept at bay, and the gods received their due. When it was neglected, chaos, Isfet, crept in, taking the form of natural disaster, political instability, or foreign invasion. Pharaohs were judged not simply by military success or economic strength, but by their capacity to maintain this balance. Thus, by presenting a world that has fallen into Isfet, and then announcing a ruler who will restore Ma'at, the prophecy of Neferti frames kingship as a spiritual and cosmic act. Later interpretations have generally treated the prophecy as a literary and ideological artifact, not as an actual prediction from the Old Kingdom. Egyptologists note that the language and style correspond to Middle Kingdom usage, and there is no evidence the text existed prior to that era. Rather than being a transmission of ancient foresight, it is more likely a construction tailored to the needs of a specific moment in time. This does not diminish its significance. On the contrary, it reveals how ancient rulers and scribes understood the power of narrative, the ability to shape belief, memory, and political identity through carefully chosen words. There is, however, a richness to the text that transcends its immediate political purpose. The pattern it employs, decline followed by redemption through a chosen leader, echoes across cultures and centuries. Whether in prophetic books of the Hebrew Bible, visions from Zoroastrian texts, or medieval Christian apocalyptic writings, this structure recurs with remarkable consistency. It suggests not only a political strategy, but a psychological and cultural rhythm. In times of crisis, societies seek explanations, and within those explanations they seek hope, often embodied in the figure of a just and powerful leader who will make right what has gone wrong. The prophecy of Neferti, then, occupies a place at the intersection of literature, politics, and belief. As a historical document, it offers insight into the strategies of royal legitimation during a time of national reorganization. As a literary work, it reflects the sophistication of Middle Kingdom writing and its engagement with themes of order, identity, and restoration. And as a prophetic text, it shows how ancient Egypt contributed to the long global tradition of using foresight, whether real or constructed, to frame power and purpose. Its legacy, though less well known than that of biblical or classical prophecies, lies in its influence on how later periods understood the relationship between kingship and destiny. In Egypt, the idea of the righteous king as restorer of Ma'at endured for millennia. Each new dynasty, especially those that arose after moments of disruption, often found ways to associate themselves with this archetype, whether through inscriptions, monuments, or formal decrees. Though the prophecy of Neferti is only one example, it captures the template with unusual clarity. Today, the text survives in a handful of manuscripts and fragments, preserved not on grand monuments, but in the laborious copies made by scribes. It was not meant for wide public consumption, but for those within or adjacent to the court, the elite who shaped policy and memory. Its survival is a testament to its perceived value, not only as political commentary, but as a model of how the past could be harnessed to serve the present. In reflecting on its place in the wider history of prophecy, the prophecy of Neferti reminds us that foresight is not always about foretelling. Sometimes it is a mirror held up to the present, offering reassurance, justification, or purpose. It is not a prophecy of what will be, but a framing of what is, dressed in the authority of the past and the inevitability of the future. And in this, it shares common ground with many prophetic traditions, where the act of speaking the future is, in truth, an act of shaping the now.